The desert highway stretched endless before him, a ribbon of cracked asphalt under a burning sky. Johnny Cash had no destination, just the hum of his Cadillac, the ghost of an old song in his throat, and the weight of a past that never quite let go. Then he saw him, a lone hitchhiker standing by the roadside, shoulders slumped like a man with nowhere left to run. Johnny didn't usually stop for strangers, but something about this one, something in the way he barely lifted his head, like he'd already given up, made Johnny slow down. That single act of kindness would change everything. Because Willow Creek wasn't just a town, it was a trap. The sun hung low over the desert highway, bleeding orange into the sky as Johnny Cash drove alone. His old black Cadillac rumbled beneath him, the radio humming with static between stations. He was heading nowhere in particular, just a man chasing the road, lost in his own thoughts. The wind whispered through the open window, carrying the scent of dust and something distant, something forgotten. Then he saw him. A lone figure stood by the side of the road, thumb out, shoulders slumped. The man looked rough, dust-covered. Jeans, a torn flannel, and a face that had seen too many bad days. Johnny didn't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about this one made him slow down. Maybe it was the way the man barely looked up, as if he'd already lost hope of anyone stopping. Maybe it was something else. Johnny eased the car to the side of the road, engine rumbling. The man hesitated, then stepped forward as he opened the door. Johnny met his eyes in the rearview mirror, dark, hollow, haunted. "Where you headed?" Johnny asked, voice steady as ever. "Nowhere," the man muttered. Then, after a pause, "Anywhere but here." Johnny pressed his boot against the gas, and the Cadillac rolled forward, swallowing the endless stretch of highway. The hitchhiker sat stiff in the passenger seat, hands clasped like he was holding something invisible between his fingers. Silence filled the space between them, thick as the desert heat. Johnny flicked his eyes over. "Got a name?" The man hesitated. "Call me Eli." His voice was rough, like gravel under tires. Johnny nodded. He'd met plenty of men like Eli, running from something, maybe running from themselves. "Where are you coming from?" Eli shifted in his seat. "Don't matter." Then softer. "Just glad you stopped." Ahead, the glow of streetlights flickered to life. A small town rose from the desert, its silhouette etched against the fading sun. A rusted sign loomed over the road. "Welcome to Willow Creek, a good place to call home." The Cadillac rolled into Willow Creek, its tires kicking up dust that lingered in the still evening air. Johnny scanned the streets, too clean, too quiet. A few folks stood outside the diner, watching as if newcomers were a rare sight. Something about their smiles felt forced, like they were holding their breath beneath their grins. Eli slouched, lower in his seat. His fingers drummed against his knee, restless. As they slowed near the town square, red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. A patrol car slid behind them, then pulled up alongside. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, rolled down his window. A thick mustache sat above his grin. Wide, practiced, perfect. "Evening, gentlemen," the man said. "Welcome to Willow Creek. I'm Sheriff Beaumont." His voice was honeyed, smooth as a radio preacher's. "Everything all right?" Eli stared straight ahead, muscles tight. Johnny rested an arm on the wheel, giving the sheriff a slow nod. "Yeah, just passing through." Beaumont's eyes lingered on Eli a second too long. His smile never wavered. "Well now," he drawled, "hope you boys enjoy your stay." Johnny felt the sheriff's eyes on him like the desert sun, hot, pressing, unrelenting. Beaumont's smile didn't budge, but something in his gaze sent a message clear as day. "This is my town." Eli finally spoke, voice low. "We should go." Johnny glanced over. Eli's fingers were digging into his jeans, knuckles white. His whole body was coiled tight, like a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. That alone made Johnny hesitate. Running never sat right with him. Not when there were questions left unanswered. Beaumont must have sensed it, too. "Not much out there past Willow Creek," he said, resting an arm on his door. "Last stop for a long stretch. You fellas are welcome to stay the night. Got a good little motel up the road." Eli turned sharply. "No." Johnny exhaled through his nose. The whole town felt like a stage play where everyone knew their lines but him. He had a choice: press forward into the unknown or turn back to the open road. He cut the engine. "We'll stay." The motel sat at the edge of town, a squat L-shaped building with flickering neon letters that read Creekside Inn, though half the sign was burned out, leaving only Cree Inn. Fitting, Johnny thought. The place had an itch to it, like a song out of tune. The woman at the front desk handed over a key without asking questions. "Room 6, she said, her smile stretching just a little too wide. "Sleep well." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old carpet and something faintly metallic. Eli dropped onto the bed, his body tense. Johnny leaned against the dresser, arms crossed. "All right," he said. "What's got you spooked?" Eli shook his head. "I told you we shouldn't be here." His voice was tight, eyes darting to the window like something might be watching. "This town? It ain't what it seems." Johnny's gut told him Eli wasn't just paranoid. And when the lights flickered, once, twice, then cut out completely, he knew the night was far from over. The room sat in pitch-black silence, the hum of the motel's lights swallowed whole. Johnny stayed still, listening. Outside, the desert. Wind scraped against the window, but there was something beneath it, something slow. Footsteps. Eli stiffened. "It's them," he whispered. Johnny reached for his duffel bag, fingers brushing against the cold steel of his flask before settling on something heavier. He didn't like carrying a gun, but a lifetime of hard miles had taught him a simple truth. Sometimes the road carried more than ghosts. The footsteps stopped just outside their door. A shadow passed under the thin strip of light beneath it. Then, tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knock. Johnny exhaled. "You expecting someone?" Eli's voice was barely a breath. "We need to get out of here. Now." Johnny tightened his grip on the doorknob, his heartbeat steady. Every instinct told him opening that door was a mistake. He glanced at Eli, who shook his head, eyes wide with warning. "Don't," Eli whispered. The knock came again, harder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Whoever was on the other side wasn't leaving. Johnny made his choice. He motioned toward the window. "Back door," he murmured. "Now." Eli didn't argue. He moved fast, sliding the window open as quietly as possible. Johnny followed, stepping onto the cool dirt outside just as the door handle twisted. The motel room creaked open behind them. Johnny risked a glance back. In the sliver of moonlight, a shadow stood in the doorway. A familiar voice drifted out, slow and patient. "Now, boys, that ain't very neighborly." Johnny and Eli ducked behind the motel, pressed against the wall as their breath came sharp and quick. Footsteps crunched on gravel, steady, unhurried. The sheriff wasn't chasing, he was waiting. Eli gritted his teeth. "He's playing with us." Johnny peered around the corner. Beaumont stood in the lot, hands on his hips, his patrol car parked nearby. He looked up at the sky as if he had all the time in the world. A couple of townsfolk lingered in the distance, their expressions unreadable, watching, always watching. Johnny exhaled through his nose. "We can't just run." Eli's jaw clenched. "Then what do we do?" Johnny weighed their choices, none of them good. They could try to sneak out of town, but he had a feeling Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place you just walked away from. And something told him the sheriff would be waiting at every turn. He looked at Eli. "We go to him." Eli's eyes went wide. "Are you insane?" Johnny adjusted his jacket, stepping out of the shadows. "You want to spend all night running?" "'Cause I don't." He strode forward, slow and deliberate, toward the man standing under the neon glow of the motel sign. Sheriff Beaumont smiled. as Johnny approached, tipping his hat. "Well now," he said, voice smooth as whiskey. "Took you long enough." Johnny stopped a few feet from the sheriff, meeting his gaze with the calm of a man who had seen too much to scare easy. "Seems like you've been expecting us," Beaumont chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, I expect everything in this town." He glanced past Johnny. "And I'd say your friend here knows exactly why." Eli's hands curled into fists, but he stayed silent. Johnny didn't look back at him. Instead, he kept his focus on Beaumont. "If you've got something to say, say it." Beaumont sighed, feigning disappointment. "I was hoping you'd enjoy our little town before things got complicated." His smile widened. "But I suppose it's time we stop pretending, ain't it?" Johnny's gut twisted. He'd been in enough bad places to recognize the weight of something unsaid. The air in Willow Creek was thick with it, like a song that never quite resolved. Eli took a step forward. "He's lying," he said, voice tight. "Don't trust a damn word he says?" Beaumont let out a slow chuckle. "Now, Eli, you wound me." He turned back to Johnny. "You see, friend, this town's got rules. Folks here understand the value of keeping things in order." His smile sharpened. "And we don't take kindly to strangers stirring the pot." Johnny studied him, then the faces of the people still watching from the sidewalks, their expressions blank and unreadable. What the hell was this place? Johnny glanced at Eli. "You know what he's talking about?" Eli hesitated, shoulders stiff. Then, quietly, "Yeah." Beaumont clapped his hands together. "There it is." He gestured around them. "Eli here was once part of our little family. A shame he decided to step out of line." His voice took on a darker edge. "Not many folks get to leave Willow Creek. Even fewer get to come back." Eli's breath hitched. Johnny could see the weight of memory settle over him, heavy as chains. But it wasn't fear in his eyes now. It was guilt. Johnny exhaled. "And I'm guessing you don't want him leaving again." Beaumont grinned. "See? You catch on quick." Johnny rubbed his jaw, feeling the tension settle in his bones. He didn't know Eli's past, but he knew the look of a man who carried sins on his back. "So what happens now?" Beaumont spread his arms. "That's up to you, friend." He cocked his head. "You're a man of good judgment. You understand when to walk away." Johnny's fingers twitched at his side. The sheriff was giving him an out, a chance to leave Eli behind. Eli turned to Johnny, something desperate in his eyes. "Don't let them take me." Johnny had spent his life singing about the weight of choices. Now one sat heavy in his hands. The key. Town was silent, waiting. Johnny felt their eyes pressing in, unseen, but everywhere. He took a slow breath. "I don't walk away from folks in trouble," he said. Beaumont sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed father. "Shame." The sheriff nodded, and before Johnny could react, rough hands grabbed his arms, shoving him forward. Townsfolk, men who had been watching from the shadows, silent, strong, waiting for the signal. Eli tried to fight, but he was outnumbered. Johnny twisted, teeth clenched. "You're making a mistake." Beaumont just smiled. "No, son," he said softly. "You did." They marched Johnny and Eli down the empty streets, past dim-lit storefronts and houses with curtains drawn tight. Nobody stopped to help. Nobody even looked. Johnny's mind worked fast. He'd been in tight spots before, bar fights, backroom deals gone south. But this was something else. This wasn't just about Eli. This town had rules. Beaumont led them to a 2-story brick building, the sheriff's office. He opened the door, gesturing inside. "After you, gentlemen." Eli hesitated. Johnny squared his shoulders, stepping through the door first. Whatever was waiting for them, he'd face it head on. The sheriff's office smelled of old wood and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where time stood still. Johnny and Eli were shoved into a holding cell, the bars cold against Johnny's palms. As he steadied himself, Beaumont leaned against the desk, tipping his hat back. "You know, Cash, I like you," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. I respect a man who stands by his word. But see, that word? It don't mean much in Willow Creek. Johnny met his gaze steady. You got me here. Now what? The sheriff chuckled, walking toward the door. Now? He shot Johnny a smirk. Now you see what happens to folks who don't belong? As soon as the door clicked shut, Eli sank onto the bench, hands buried in his hair. He looked more exhausted than afraid, like a man who knew the ending of a story before it was told. Johnny sat beside him. You going to tell me what's really going on? Eli exhaled, slow and shaky. I used to live here, he admitted. Grew up in this town, believed in it. But it ain't real, Johnny. It's a lie. He looked up, eyes hollow. Nobody leaves Willow Creek, not unless the sheriff lets them. Johnny frowned. And you? Eli swallowed hard. I ran. I got out. His voice dropped. And I left someone behind. Johnny studied Eli's face, watching the way his fingers twitched. Nerves, regret, something deeper. Who? Eli's throat bobbed. My sister. The weight of those words settled heavy in the small cell. Johnny didn't speak, letting Eli fill the silence. I was supposed to take her with me, Eli murmured, but I was a coward. I left her in their hands and I never came back. Until now. His eyes met Johnny's, pleading. I have to find her. Johnny sat back, considering. If she's still here, they're not just going to let you walk up to her. Eli's jaw tightened. I don't plan on asking. The door creaked open and Beaumont stepped back inside, arms crossed. I had a feeling you'd be catching up on old memories. His gaze flickered to Eli. Talking about dear little Maggie, are we? Eli went rigid. Where is she? Beaumont smirked. Now, that's not how this works. He turned his attention to Johnny. You're an outsider, Cash. You don't know what you've stepped into. Johnny leaned forward, voice steady. Then tell me. Beaumont grinned. All right, let's make a deal. He folded his hands. You play a show for the town. Tomorrow night. Give them a real special performance, and in return I'll take... You write to her? Eli's breath caught. Johnny, no. Johnny held up a hand. He met Beaumont's gaze, searching for the trick, the hidden strings. But he already knew. The show was just the beginning. The next night Johnny stood on a makeshift stage in the center of town, a borrowed guitar slung over his shoulder. The streets were lined with townsfolk, faces expectant, watching. The sheriff stood front and center, hands folded behind his back, his grin never fading. Johnny strummed a chord, the deep hum vibrating through his bones. He'd played in front of thousands, stood beneath the brightest lights. But this felt different. The air was thick, the weight of unseen things pressing down. His voice rang out, smooth, but edged with something raw. Well, I hear that train a-comin', rollin' round the bend. The crowd swayed, hypnotized. Johnny saw it then. This wasn't just entertainment. This was ritual. And somewhere inside the shadows, Eli was watching, waiting for his moment. Johnny played, watching the crowd. The townsfolk swayed in unison, eyes half-lidded, lips moving along as if the music were some kind of prayer. It wasn't just a performance, it was control. Eli stood near the back, shifting restlessly. The sheriff hadn't moved, arms crossed, smiling like a man who knew exactly how this night would end. Johnny's fingers kept strumming, but his mind raced. If Maggie was still here, what had they done to her? What had they done to all these people? The song was part of it. He felt it in his bones, and then a voice, barely above a whisper, reached his ears. Help me. Johnny's fingers faltered, a single sour note breaking the spell. The crowd barely reacted. But the sheriff's grin twitched. He heard it too. He scanned the faces, and then he saw her. A woman, barely more than a shadow in the crowd, staring at him with wide, pleading eyes, dark hair, hollow cheeks. Something about her was all wrong, like she was awake in a town full of sleepwalkers. Maggie, Eli saw her too. His whole body tensed, but he didn't move. Not yet. Johnny adjusted the guitar strap, voice steady, as he said into the mic, "That's enough for tonight." The sheriff's smile vanished. The silence stretched. thick as tar. The crowd stood, eerily still, waiting for permission to move, waiting for Beaumont. Johnny set the guitar down. "We had a deal." Beaumont exhaled slowly, like a man indulging a child. "Oh, we're keeping our deal." He gestured, and two of his deputies stepped forward, hands resting on their holsters. "You're free to see Maggie, all right." His grin returned, sharp and cold. "But she ain't leaving." Eli lunged, but Johnny caught his arm. Not yet. The town wasn't just watching anymore. They were closing in. Johnny looked back at Maggie. She hadn't moved, just stood there, eyes locked on him. He nodded once. Her lips parted. "Run!" Chaos erupted. Eli tore free from Johnny's grip, shoving through the crowd toward Maggie. The townsfolk moved at once, not shouting, not screaming, just closing in, like a tide coming to swallow them whole. Beaumont barely flinched. He just turned to Johnny and sighed. "Shame," he muttered, drawing his revolver. "I really did like you." Johnny ducked as the shot rang out, the bullet splintering. Wood behind him. Eli reached Maggie, grabbing her wrist, but the crowd pulled them apart, faceless hands clawing, dragging. Johnny surged forward, grabbing the guitar by the neck. He swung. The heavy wood cracked across a deputy's head, sending him sprawling, and then they were running. Johnny, Eli, and Maggie barreled through the streets, dust kicking up in their wake. The town roared behind them, no sirens, no alarms, just the thundering march of footsteps. Maggie gasped. "They won't let us go." Eli held tight to her wrist. "We ain't asking." Johnny spotted his Cadillac parked where he'd left it. Beaumont's men were gaining, but they weren't rushing. They moved slow, measured, like they already knew how this ended. Johnny yanked open the car door. "Get in." Eli shoved Maggie inside. Johnny slid behind the wheel, slamming his foot on the gas. The tires screeched, kicking up gravel. The headlights cut through the night as the road stretched ahead, then up ahead, standing dead center in the road. Sheriff Beaumont, waiting, smiling. Johnny's grip tightened on the wheel. The sheriff stood in the headlights, his shadow stretching long across the pavement, hands resting easy on his belt. Daring Johnny to make a choice, Eli's voice was frantic. "Hit him! Just hit him!" Johnny's foot hovered over the pedal. Beaumont wasn't reaching for his gun. He wasn't moving at all. There was something wrong, something unnatural in the way he stood there, completely unafraid. Maggie clutched Johnny's arm. "Don't stop," she whispered. "He doesn't die like other men." Johnny slammed his foot down. The Cadillac roared forward, engine howling as it shot toward the sheriff. The headlights swallowed him whole, and then he was gone. No impact, no scream, just empty road. Johnny's pulse pounded. He yanked the wheel hard, swerving wildly to regain control. Eli twisted in his seat, eyes wide. "Where the hell did he—" A thud. A heavy thump against the roof of the car. Metal groaned. Then, a voice, low and taunting, right above them. "Now, Johnny, that ain't very polite." Johnny swerved, tires screaming, as the Cadillac fish-tailed. Something heavy rolled across the roof, a shadow shifting past the windshield. Beaumont landed in front of them, crouched, perfectly balanced, like he'd just stepped off a curb instead of being thrown off a speeding car. His smile never wavered. His eyes burned in the dark. Maggie let out a shaky breath. "He's bound to this place," she said. "To Willow Creek." Her fingers dug into Johnny's arm. "We can't kill him, but we can leave." Johnny locked eyes with Beaumont. The sheriff knew it, too. That's why he was stalling. Johnny shifted gears. Then, "Let's go!" The car roared past the sheriff, gravel spitting as Johnny gunned it toward the highway's edge. The town was behind them, shrinking in the rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead, long, empty, leading. Somewhere else, Maggie clung to Eli, shaking. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" Johnny clenched his jaw. The headlights carved through the darkness. No more footsteps, no more voices, just the hum of the open road. Eli exhaled, almost laughing. "We made it," he muttered. Then Johnny glanced at the rearview mirror, just once, and Willow Creek was gone. The road stretched endless before them. The sky was wide, the air clear. The only thing behind them was desert, as if the town had never been there at all. Eli stared out the window, rubbing his face. Jesus. Maggie sat in the back, silent. After a long moment, she whispered, "We weren't the first." Johnny didn't answer. He just drove. The wind pressed against the car, humming a tune only he could hear. The kind of song that didn't need words, the kind that stayed with you. Ahead, the horizon burned gold with the first light of morning. Johnny Cash never looked back. If you loved this dark and gripping tale of mystery, suspense, and the legendary Johnny Cash facing something far worse than outlaws, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Who knows? Maybe out on some dusty highway there's another town like Willow Creek waiting. Would you stop for the Hitchhiker? Let us know in the comments.